Hey Optimancers, Chris here. So, you know I love spells in D&D. And with one D&D playtest, we've already seen some spell redesign. Some of it is really good. Like, I love the new version of Barkskin. And come on, we all knew that Barkskin needed to be redone. Others, I think, need some work. Like the Resistance cantrip, it's definitely too potent now. Though I do like it being reaction-based. But that's the point of the playtest. We get to evaluate these things and give them feedback so they can continue to rework things until they get it right. The promising thing is that it means that they know the current version of these spells in 5th edition just aren't right. But let's face it, we've barely begun as far as spells that could use an update. So in today's video, I'm going to go over 11 examples I'm wishing designers would take back to the drawing board. I wanted it to be 10. Top 10 videos are a YouTube staple for a reason, but I couldn't quite narrow it to 10. Creating this list isn't as easy as you might think it would be. When I decided to plan for this video, I figured the first step is to go through all the spells in D&D and list all the ones I figured that could use tweaking, and then I would narrow it down to the top 10. I abandoned that as soon as I realized my list would include most spells in print. So then I decided to just look at the player's handbook spells, and I might as well skip any spell that's already seen redesign in a 1D&D playtest packet because obviously the D&D studio already knows these spells need reworking. The list was massive, and as I started narrowing down the minor offenders, like Sacred Flame having that weird bit about saving throws against cover, which was apparently included because they figured that Sacred Flame comes down from above, but the lightning strikes from Call Lightning didn't get the same treatment for some reason. Anyways, those were really small tweaks, and I started to notice a pattern. There were lots of reasons that spells could use an update, but those same reasons were popping up again and again. So I decided to list the reasons spells needed updating. Were there 10 of those? Yes, there were, but unfortunately there was one more, so I ended up with 11. So rather than tell you this spell needs to be redesigned because of being too powerful, and this spell needs to be redesigned because of being too powerful, instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the most prominent example, in my opinion, for each reason spells in the player's handbook need updating. If anyone working at Wizards of the Coast is watching, you could call this my top 10 wish list plus one. Now, YouTube likes it if I say these will be presented in order from least to most important to update. But to be honest, I couldn't really decide, so here they are in no particular order. 11 examples of spells that all have different issues that require their redesign. Doesn't really slip off the tongue, does it? Okay, 10 spells that need fixing plus one. This channel is supported by my patrons on Patreon, and today I would like to thank my Archmage level patrons. These folks see my videos early and without ads, they get a monthly call out, like they do right now, and we play role-playing games together monthly. They run and play in games, and I join in multiple times each month. If you would be interested in supporting this channel, please check the link in the video description. So thank you to Aaron Kaler, Adam Langley, Rob Reichelt, Awesome Face, Benjamin, Brett McDowell, CJ, Dash Panther, Dave Peters, David Lotz, David W. Skibbins, DM Michael 7000, Eleanor, Gakamaru, Ian Johnson, James Thomas, Jad Zan, John Cripps, Jonathan Haynes, Jonathan Lexi, K.J. Aurelio, Kurt G., Kavathe, LaFerja, Marlon Rooks, Nathaniel McCauley, Nick Simmons, Rye Squy, Satqueni7, Stephen Edmondson, and TUM. And an additional thank you to all my patrons. Your support is appreciated so much. Let's get started. Number 11. Spells should never be automatic passes. Now, there are lots of spells in the game you would normally never take because they're really circumstantial. Like, I'm not normally taking the Arcane Lock spell, but I have absolutely had times where I wish I had the Arcane Lock spell. Then, the player who does take that spell gets their moment to shine with a cool use of a circumstantial spell, and that's just fine. Spells like Disguise Self, Knock, Magic Circle. These kinds of spells aren't useful all the time, but when they are, it's cool. But there are other spells that never have that moment. There's so many spells I could list here. Mordenkainen's Sword, Crown of Madness, Witch Bolt, Weird, but we all know the king of spells that a player will never consider. True Strike. Nobody ever makes a build and thinks, maybe True Strike would be good on this build. No, it won't. True Strike is just a clutter of text in the player's handbook that players have trained themselves to just skip over. When I'm considering an attack cantrip, I can look at Firebolt, Ray of Frost, and Chill Touch, and I can think of reasons why I might prefer any of them. Firebolt does the most damage and can damage objects. Ray of Frost slows down the target in addition to the damage. Chill Touch prevents them from healing. That could be immensely useful. As players, these are the kinds of spell decisions that are actually fun. What cool new option do I want my character to have that maybe my last character didn't have? I know. Give up an attack so I can roll twice for my next attack. Get a spell like Fear, except targets don't have to run away, and why don't we make it 9th level? Get a spell like Spiritual Weapon, except let's make it require concentration and make it 7th level. Fixing True Strike wouldn't be that hard. Give it some duration, and then it's expended on your next attack. So you could reasonably have it precast, or maybe have it work on someone else, so you could buff the attack of someone who does a lot more damage than you. How about a flat bonus to hit, so it could be combined with advantage? Something. It's okay for a spell to be a rare pick, but if it is an automatic miss, then it needs an update. Now based on that, the next one should be obvious. Number 10, don't have spells that are automatic picks. I like the Spirit Guardian spell. I mean, the half movement wording could probably be changed to difficult terrain for cleaner mechanics, but I like the thematics. I like the creativity the players demonstrate when they describe the spell. What I don't like is that almost every 5th level cleric is going to inevitably have this spell. I like the web spell. It's cool, and the mechanical design of it is actually fairly clean. I don't run into many cases where the spell text doesn't explain how it should work. What I don't like is that nearly every 3rd level wizard and sorcerer inevitably has this spell. The worst example, though, in my opinion, is the shield spell. Almost every 5th level cleric inevitably has Spirit Guardians. Almost every 3rd level wizard or sorcerer inevitably has web. But shield, you pick the class. Get a level dip, a feat, a race, something that gets you the shield spell. Why? Because it's just that good. Now there's other features in the game that provide comparable benefits. The light cleric gets warding flare. Monks get patient defense. Battlemaster fighters can get the parry maneuver. The issue is that none of these features come close to the shield spell. Here's the worst part. I think the idea of the shield spell is that sorcerers and wizards, who get no built-in armor proficiencies, would have a way to expend a spell slot as a reaction for a magical defense to make up for that deficiency. Except, the shield spell is so much better when combined with armor and shield. So those unarmored wizards and sorcerers are actually getting less benefit from this spell than others do. So you see two things happen a lot. Either another class dips wizard or sorcerer to get the shield spell, or a wizard or sorcerer dip another class to get that armor and shield proficiency, and then this spell becomes way more potent. I'm starting to see the community is starting to come around to the collective realization that this spell needs some kind of update. So I've seen a lot of house rule fixes. Maybe it should only provide a benefit if you aren't wearing armor or using a shield. Or maybe just if you aren't using a shield. Maybe it should apply to only a single attack. Maybe it should provide a smaller initial bonus, but be upcastable for a bigger bonus. Maybe it shouldn't be a 1st level spell at all. All these sound like reasonable suggestions to me. What I'd love to see is for 1D&D to either provide one of these solutions or something else, then let us review, test it, and provide our feedback. Number 9. A spell's name should not be misleading. I think this one will not be controversial. So if you call a spell Featherfall, it should have you fall like a feather. If you call a spell Death Ward, it should ward off death. And if you call a spell Find Traps, it should find traps. Find Traps doesn't find traps though. It alerts you to the presence of traps within a certain range, but it does not find them. Knowing there's a trap somewhere in the treasure room is way different than knowing the lock on the 3rd treasure chest is trapped. But it really comes down to this. If the spell is called Find Traps, this phrase here, you don't learn the location of each trap, just shouldn't be here. The spell name implies you will learn the location of traps. Either the spell should provide the location of traps, or the name of the spell should be changed. I guess you could call it Detect Traps. Though honestly, this spell probably needs complete redesign. Another problem with this spell is, when do you cast it? Well, if you suspect a trap is nearby. But if you suspect a trap is nearby already, then you're already alert to the likelihood of a trap being nearby. So this is really providing minimal information at a point where you probably didn't need that information in the first place. Like, maybe this should be cast on someone, and then they get advantage on any ability check made to detect the presence of traps for the next 24 hours or something. In that case, it would actually be helping the individual to find traps, and well within the power level we would expect for a second level spell. Anyways, a litmus test that should occur with every single spell is look at the spell name, then look at the spell description. Does the name imply the spell does something it doesn't do? Then something needs to change. Another example of this is the daylight spell. Would you think the light from a spell called daylight might be considered sunlight? I sure would. Whether you're fighting drow or vampires or whatever, daylight isn't going to have the impact that the spell name would have implied. That's not good. Call it greater light or something. Or make it sunlight. On to number 8. You can't have it both ways. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes the results of a spell are vague, and sometimes they are rigidly defined. But when you start mixing those two things, you do need to be careful. For example, what can be accomplished with an illusion spell is usually vague, and I get the necessity of that. Will the monster be tricked by the minor illusion of the growl of a potential enemy coming this way? There's too many possible variations to create any hard rules for that. So the vagueness is basically a requirement, and then it leaves it in the hands of the DM to determine what's reasonable for that situation. So they can have it work, they can have it not work, or maybe they tie it to an ability check or something. But when you start to remove that vagueness without removing all of it, that's actually when the big problems come up. Take the Phantasmal Force spell. Like any illusion spell, what exactly can be accomplished with it is left in the hands of the player and the DM, except this paragraph right here. While a target is affected by the spell, the target treats the phantasm as if it were real. The target rationalizes any illogical outcomes from interacting with the phantasm. This is the danger of having vague spells with hard mechanical results, but vague implementation, because the spellcaster is given unlimited latitude here to create illusions that can do pretty much anything to the target, and they have to play ball no matter how absurd it is. Now, according to Christopher Perkins, if a spell applies any sort of condition, its description will say so, which maybe limits the power somewhat, but it also creates more questions than it actually answers. So if my illusion is a giant tentacle that wraps around the creature, preventing it from moving, well, then I guess it's not grappled or restrained as in the conditions, but can it move? I don't know. It is supposed to treat the tentacle as if it were real. What about a box of opaque purple force shutting in the target? Well, it's not officially blinded or restrained, but it's trapped and it has no way to see past the barrier. The real issue with Phantasmal Force is that it goes into dangerous territory of providing either too much detail or not enough. If the target must treat the illusion as if it's real, then we need more parameters as to what exactly can be accomplished with it. If we're not going to provide those parameters, then the DM needs more latitude in how the target reacts to the illusion. Phantasmal Force finds itself in this terrible place of trying to have it both ways. If the purpose of Phantasmal Force is to have an illusion spell that the target absolutely believes is real, because of the saving throw presumably, then it should have more defined options for what can be accomplished. Number 7. Spells should make the game more fun. If a spell makes the game less fun, well, that's a pretty big sin for a spell to have. The purpose of Leomund's Tiny Hut is clear. The spellcaster casts this as a ritual, and then the party can have a safer long rest. I actually really like that as a concept for a spell. The issue is that Leomund's Tiny Hut is just too effective at its job. So instead of giving you a safer long rest, for the most part, it just gives a flat-out safe long rest. All other creatures and objects are barred from passing through it. Spells and magical effects can't extend or be cast through it. That doesn't mean it's necessarily infallible, but it becomes pretty close to infallible. The T-Rex that happens by an opaque dome it doesn't recognize is unlikely to have the dispel magic spell it needs to threaten those within, or even understand that there's anything within to threaten. Lehman's tiny hut isn't giving us an advantage here, or made us safer, it's just removed the challenge entirely. Oh, and since creatures and objects within the dome when you cast a spell can move through it freely, that means your arrows can be shot out, even though arrows can't be shot in. You shoot with advantage, by the way, because you can see out and they can't see in. The defenses on this are just too comprehensive for a spell of this level, particularly a ritual spell. But it's not just a balance thing. When the party casts this and starts their long rest, at least they have reasonable assurance that the long rest won't have any nasty surprises. And the thing is, nasty surprises can be fun. Even fewer nasty surprises are possible when it's clarified that the tiny hut has a floor. Now even burrowing creatures are excluded from being a challenge. A ritual that can make your long rest more comfortable by ensuring your environment is comfortable and dry, that it's lit or dark inside, that it's opaque from the outside but you can see out of it, that alone is probably worth the ritual before you make it impenetrable. Now I have to give some very honorable mentions here. Counterspell, which was almost my prime example for this kind of problem. Like with Lehman's tiny hut, I like the idea of counterspell, but it being a 100% thing was a mistake. Have the casters make an opposed spellcasting ability check or something. A second honorable mention to Wall of Force, which probably should have hit points rather than flat out being indestructible. Number 6, saving throws should mean something. Heat Metal is a pretty cool spell, but there's just an odd mechanical interaction right here. If a creature is holding or wearing the object and takes damage from it, the creature must succeed on a Constitution saving throw or drop the object if it can. If it doesn't drop the object, it has disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks. This is a weird interaction. I'm wearing a breastplate and you cast Heat Metal on it, and according to this, I must make a Constitution saving throw. Why? What does that saving throw accomplish? My making or failing the saving throw makes no difference at all. If the saving throw was to avoid the disadvantage on attack rolls and ability checks, that would make sense. But here it starts out by saying you must make a saving throw, implying that saving throw is meaningful, but unless you can drop the object, which is going to exclude most worn items, then it's useless. Also, even if you can drop the item, you make your save and you still have the disadvantage, so you are still hugely affected by the spell, and the saving throw really doesn't matter that much. It's also kind of weird to call for a saving throw on a spell that's listed as not having a saving throw, just kind of hidden in the middle of the text. Like, you could simplify this spell a lot by just getting rid of this paragraph altogether. It's still a decent spell. 2d8 damage with your bonus action each round, no saving throw, and then the creature could just drop a held object if it wanted to, which, if you target their weapon, is still probably a good result. But if you do want to include a saving throw, then the saving throw should be meaningful. You should avoid at least the secondary effects of the spell if you make it. So you could keep the saving throw, but if you make it, then you surely shouldn't have the disadvantage. Number 5, spells shouldn't be overcomplicated. A lot of the spells in the game are really simple, like the Dark Vision spell. You cast it, someone gets 60-foot Dark Vision for 8 hours. Easy peasy. Then we have more complex spells, like Etherealness, because we need some explanation as to what someone who is ethereal can do and can't do. So it's more complicated, but if we read it, we pretty much have the gist. Then there are spells like Magic Jar. Requiring 6 paragraphs to explain how a spell works is a big red flag. And as someone who has dissected these paragraphs word by word, I can tell you that for this spell, you could probably have 6 more without answering every question. Also, when you have this much text explaining the mechanics of a spell, you are certain to make some mistakes. For example, this whole interaction mess of your body, the container, and the possessed creature's body creates all kinds of ambiguities, especially when you have a game where your body, when you cast a spell, might not even be your own body once you start mixing in other spells like Clone and Simulacrum and whatnot. It just becomes a confusing mess. Spells like Mirage Arcane also fit in this category. And I generally like to propose some fixes, as I've done for every spell I've covered so far, and I'll provide for every spell after this one. But I am probably the wrong person to fix this spell. Heck, I can even edit my videos down to a reasonable length. But simplification of this spell and spells like it should be a priority of 1D&D. Number 4, spell text should be concise. There are spells in the game that could be cleaned up just by wording them more clearly. Hunger of Hadar is a flavorful spell. It is also a confusing spell. Does it create magical darkness? Maybe. It creates a sphere of blackness, so maybe that counts as magical darkness, or maybe it's an inky black cloud. You need to tell us which, because this spell text is so caught up in being flavorful, it's forgotten to tell us how it works. A creature within the area is blinded. So, can you see into the Hunger of Hadar if you're outside it? Good question, with no answer. You're blinded even if you have true sight? That seems odd. I mean, if it's supposed to operate like a fog cloud, fine. You have the text of fog cloud to draw from. If it's supposed to operate like the darkness spell, fine. You have the text of darkness to draw from. Both of those spells have more concise spell text. This spell has been worded in a way that really makes it unclear exactly what it does and how exactly it's supposed to operate. With some more concise wording, it'd probably be just fine. Number 3, don't trick the player. I've already provided multiple examples of spells that don't do what the name implies, but that's honestly just a case of poor spell naming. If a player reads the spell text, at least then they understand what the spells do, and importantly, what they can't do. There's nothing insidious about that, it's just an oversight. It's a far worse issue if the player reads the spell text and is still misinformed about what a spell does. Do you know what spell I'm about to talk about? According to the Identify spell, you touch an object while you cast a spell, and its magic reveals the item's magical properties. The text right here tells you what the spell does, except it tricks the player. Because in the Dungeon Master's Guide, the DM is informed that actually, the Identify spell doesn't work for identifying all magical properties. It fails to work to identify magical curses. Okay, that is just a dirty trick. Don't do that. If Identify doesn't work to reveal magical properties if they are curses, then the Identify spell should say that. Determining if an item is cursed before attuning to it is absolutely a reason some players choose, prepare, and cast this spell. I'm not going to dwell on this, but if the spell text says that a spell does something, don't put a secret exception in the Dungeon Master's Guide like this. Either have Identify reveal magical curses, or add in the spell text that it doesn't. It's kind of insidious to exclude that. Number 2, don't make players hunt for stat blocks. You know this one was going to be here, and by all indications, the designers have figured this one out, which is great. I, for one, am tired of this stat block. Yeah, I'm talking about the polymorph spell. Players get tired of being a great ape with every character over and over again, so they reskin it. I'm a giant rat, but it's really a reskin giant ape. I'm a giant bear, but really it's a reskin giant ape. I get told over and over again that a lot of the reason people don't like templates is because they reduce options. I don't buy it. If a player consistently chooses the same stat block, then that's not having options in any meaningful way. A revised polymorph spell could have 2 templates, one for a buff, one for a debuff, and some meaningful options could be placed within each template, like we see with the more recent summoning spell templates. If you gave me even 3 halfway balanced but meaningful customization options on a single template, that might be technically fewer choices than the 5th edition polymorph spell, but in practice, it would be more. Now, obviously, there are a number of other spells that fit into this category as well, but some of them have other issues on top of hunting for stat blocks, as we see with number 1, don't clutter initiative. Now, there are a number of examples of this in the player's handbook, but the most commonly used defender I see is conjure animals. The spells like conjure minor elementals and conjure woodland beings absolutely fall into this category as well. We're adding up to 8 creatures to initiative, and honestly, it's usually 8, and then 8 additional turns need to be taken, and although you can clump the initiative, you can't so easily clump up the turns. Then 8 more creatures to keep track of positions for, 8 more creatures to keep track of hit points, 8 more creatures to monitor conditions for. I mean, even if those creatures don't have their own initiative, like we see with animate objects, it still bogs down the game. Now, I'm not against the idea of summoning or animating. I'm against turning combat into a slog. We've seen a great deal of improvement in more recent spell design in this area, but as long as the original Player's Handbook spells remain more powerful, we have issues until they receive some much needed updates. And I gotta say, the right time to take care of conjure animals probably would have been the playtest with the druid in it. Like, why wasn't it there? I mentioned at the start of this video, these were presented in no particular order, but I'm curious which of these issues you think is the most egregious. And if there's a type of issue with spells that maybe I missed, share it with us in the comments. Otherwise, until next time, I'm going to sit back, relax, and have some fun. D&D is for everyone. Thanks everybody, and I'll talk to you soon.